Dame community to the richness of the Catholic literary heritage. In an age when names such as Chesterton, Waugh, and O'Connor have little or no meaning to many undergraduate students, even Catholic ones, we at the Center for Ethics and Culture hope to promote such writers both for the quality of their works and the uniquely Catholic dimension of their literary perspectives. This year's series, Close to Catholic, a celebration of kindred spirits, features 4 influential and fascinating authors, none of whom were actually Catholic. Yet the writings of T.S. Eliot, Simone Weil, C.S. Lewis, and Fyodor Dostoevsky all share much in common with Catholic theology and philosophy. With these lectures, we hope to inspire Notre Dame undergraduates to read and appreciate the work of these great non-Catholic luminaries as invaluable to their Catholic formation. Tonight's final lecture will analyze the life and work of Fyodor Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky was born in Russia in 1821. As a young man, he was sentenced to death for his connections to a liberal intellectual society. His sentence was changed at the last minute to 4 years of exile in Siberia. During this time, Dostoevsky embraced the Russian Orthodox faith, and following this period, Dostoevsky went on to produce some of the greatest works of literature ever written. Some may be puzzled by the choice of Fyodor Dostoevsky to be the final subject of this series. It seems strange to label a man whose work frequently attacks the Roman Catholic Church close to Catholic. However, the deeply Christian themes that reveal themselves in Dostoevsky's painfully insightful portrayals of humanity make him a central reading for any educated Christian. Immersed in his works, one cannot shake the feeling that hidden beyond the intricate plot, there is a greater conflict, one in which the very souls of the character hang in the balance, and perhaps the soul of the reader too. Tonight we are privileged to welcome Robert Byrd, Associate Professor at the University of Chicago in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literature and Cinema and Media Studies, Associate Faculty Member in the Divinity School. Professor Byrd's main area of interest is the aesthetic, practice, and theory of Russian modernism. His first full-length book, Russian Prospero, is a comprehensive study of the poetry and thought of Vyacheslav Ivanov. He is also the author of 2 books on the filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky, titled Andrei Rublev and Andrei Tarkovsky, Elements of Cinema. His translations of Russian religious thought include On Spiritual Unity, a Slavophile Reader, and Vyacheslav Ivanov's Selected Essays. His works in progress include a biography on Dostoevsky. Please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Byrd.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. Can you hear me? Thank you very much to Dr. Solomon and Elizabeth Kirk, Catherine Wales, and her new child, and all the students who have helped to make me feel very welcome here at Notre Dame, my first visit down here. And thank you for the very generous introduction, which, as you will see, has stolen a little bit of my suspense here. But just try to forget what you just heard. Just for a moment. 2 minutes, maybe. Just make sure I know how to work this. Okay. On the 22nd of December 1849, 21 young men were led out to the parade grounds of the St. Simeon Regiment in St. Petersburg to learn their fate and submit to their punishment. They were all members of a revolutionary cell, and which had gradually turned from naive reverie to an active conspiracy to subvert the grim, iron-fisted rule of Tsar Nicholas I. Among the convicts was a young author, whose debut novel, Poor Folk, had been widely acclaimed upon publication in 1846. Upon reading it in manuscript, Nikolai Nekrasov, a leading poet and publisher of the day, had rushed to meet the author in the middle of the night. A Petersburg white night, in which the sun only just dips below the horizon for a fleeting couple of hours. The adulation of Nekrasov and his allies had been tempered by their dismay at Dostoevsky's follow-up novel, The Double, a rollicking and puzzling study of psychological collapse. But this was hopefully dismissed as an aberration, like the shallow night of the unsetting sun. Even as he struggled to write a worthy follow-up to Poor Folk, the future of Russian literature, and with it, to a large degree, of Russian civil society, seemed to rest with Dostoevsky's talented, socially committed pen. There had been no suspicion of Dostoevsky's surreptitious activities. Arrested on 22nd of April, 1849, Dostoevsky spent exactly 8 months in prison, during which time he continued to write at a furious pace. In retribution for the radiance of early summer, winter days in Petersburg end almost before they begin. Emerging onto the parade ground under the leaden sky, the convicts were stunned into morbid silence by a sentence of death pronounced on each and every one of them. They were given a crucifix to kiss, in accordance with Orthodox custom. As officers, like all educated men in this militarized society, they underwent a ritual expulsion from the army with swords snapped over their heads. As if for a baptism, they were dressed in virgin white robes. And now, heavy with guilt and with the joyless surroundings, arranged in groups of 3, they began the trudge up to their death. Our young author was in the second group, and he watched as the first group of 3 were tied to wooden poles, which stood at an annoyingly untidy slant, he noted. He remembered his beloved brother and his young family. Realizing that he had but seconds to live, he so regretted that he could not catch sight of anything hopeful or comforting. He cast his eyes heavenward and wondered whether prayer would not be counted against him. He looked before him as the drums beat out the command. The command, which as a military man Dostoevsky would have immediately understood, was one of clemency. Dostoevsky's death sentence was commuted to one of 4 years in a labor camp, followed by military service as an enlisted man. And yet, even as we hear the story, we realize that Dostoevsky must have survived to write all those famous books of the 1860s and 1870s, from Notes from Underground to Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, Demons, and The Brothers Karamazov. Yet we remain riveted to this central moment, the 22nd of December, 1849, when his death sentence was announced and then commuted. And so did he, throughout his life, remain tormented and fascinated by this moment when his life was taken away and given right back as a gift. The moment is captured slow. Like most neophiles, I'm pointing at the screen. The moment is captured in Dostoevsky's letter to his brother on the very day of the execution. Brother, I have not been grieving and I have not lost spirit. Life everywhere is life. Life is in us ourselves and not in something external. Alongside me will be people, and to be a human being among people and to remain so forever, not to grieve or falter whatever the misfortunes. This is what life is about. That is its purpose. I have understood this. This idea has entered into my flesh and blood. It's true. The mind which created, which lived the superior life of art, which has understood and reconciled itself to the sublime needs of the spirit, that mind has been severed from my shoulders. I retain the memory and images which I have created, but not yet made incarnate. They will torture me, it is true, but I still have my heart, and that very flesh and blood which can love and suffer and desire and remember, and that is life, after all. One sees the sun. Life is a gift. Life is happiness. Every minute could be a century of happiness, if only youth could know. Now changing my life, I am reborn in a new form. Brother, I swear to you that I shall not lose hope and shall keep pure my heart and soul. I shall be born again for the best. That is my hope, all my comfort. This remarkable document shows us the extent to which writing was for Dostoevsky an existential imperative. He perceived life at once as material fact, emotional experience, and as idea. His survival he saw as an idea, and he felt obliged to give this idea material form, what he says here, to make it incarnate, both in his life and in his future art, which he sees essentially as the only point of continuing to live. We see in this letter, which I must stress was written at a moment of almost indescribable trauma, a systematic statement of his aesthetic credo, which was also an ethical creed. At the same time, one sees here the limits of verbal expression, which Dostoevsky always suffered as much as the outward persecution he was subjected to. After all, those French phrases here, which I skipped over, are actually quotations from one of Dostoevsky's favorite books, namely Victor Hugo's Last Day of a Man Condemned to Death. So strangely enough, at this moment, when his life has almost been taken from him, when he has received a new life, he's quoting. He's quoting from one of his favorite authors who had written about the very experience that he had gone through. Doesn't this signal, I wonder, and I think he wondered to himself, a kind of inauthenticity at the very heart of literary expression? The Russian poet Vyacheslav Ivanov once wrote, "All of Dostoevsky's further revelations were only attempts to communicate to the world what was once revealed to him in a catastrophic inner experience." Conscious of the limits of literary expression and of Dostoevsky's writings in particular, Ivanov hints that Dostoevsky's narratives only approximate the fullness of this catastrophic inner experience which we have just examined. The underlying revelation itself remains unspeakable, or at least unnarratable. This elusive interval before the suspended execution informs Dostoevsky's very approach to narrative and suggests, I think, a universal model for modern fiction, which is precariously lodged between narrative suspense, driven towards that inevitable outcome, and the very suspension of narrative at every key moment. He was never going to be able to do justice to the truth that was revealed to him and which entered his body, his soul, and his mind at the moment before death, but he was obligated to keep seeking forms for making this experience incarnate, objective, material for others. This urgent presentness of Dostoevsky's writing, always on the brink of a catastrophe, an apocalypse, is the reason for his abiding contemporaneity. Dostoevsky was our first contemporary. He recognized the challenges of urbanism, technological society, with its new attenuated senses and emotions, with its powerful and elaborate systems of necessity, among which were the systems of mass media, in which he was an active participant. This was the very same world to which Marx and Nietzsche were reacting at the same time. Sharing many concerns with these thinkers, Dostoevsky gathered all of this into a visible focus. Again, this incarnate image that he writes about here. Yet, like these two, Marx and Nietzsche, Dostoevsky felt more confident about the critique than about his own positive teaching. Intuiting and crafting pictures of modern selfhood, Dostoevsky wondered what could heal it and what could anchor it in a world. One answer came to him in the hard labor penal colony where the noble one Dostoevsky found himself surrounded by violent criminals, with a single book on which to reflect, the New Testament. Here Dostoevsky converted to Christianity, although he had always been sympathetic, let's say, a sympathetic reader of the Gospels. And upon his release in 1854, he wrote to Nadezhda von Wiesner, who had helped him in part by giving him that very New Testament he had lived with for 4 years. And he writes here in one of, again, his very famous letters, "I am a child of my century, a child of unbelief and doubt. Even now, and I am sure to the closing of my coffin, what horrible torments this thirst to believe has cost me and is still costing me now. The stronger it becomes, the more reasons I see against it. And yet God sometimes sends me minutes in which I am absolutely calm. In these minutes I love and find that I am loved by others. And in these same minutes I have written for myself a symbol of faith in which everything is clear and sacred. This symbol of faith is very simple. It is to believe that there is nothing more beautiful, more profound, more sympathetic, more reasonable, more courageous, and more perfect than Christ. And there not only isn't, but I tell myself with a jealous love, that there cannot be. More than that, if someone succeeded in proving to me that Christ was outside the truth, and if indeed the truth was outside Christ, I would sooner remain with Christ than with the truth." This is perhaps the most forceful statement of faith in all of Dostoevsky's writings, both personal and published, written for publication. For some readers, it has suggested a troubling irrationality at the heart of Dostoevsky's Christianity, as if he adopts it not as an answer, not as this healing of the social and psychological malaise of his age, but almost as a provocation. I want to instead highlight the emphasis here, which we recognize from the earlier letter to his brother, on the aesthetic nature of truth for Dostoevsky. You note that he says this is also the most beautiful. Christ is the most beautiful thing that he can think of in the world. Dostoevsky is positing salvation as a rupture of normal discursive and existential modes, as a radical break in the nature of things, which he perceives very often as a web of forces of necessity, economic, erotic, forces of power, and at the same time as an almost erotic attraction to the image. Note that he says here that he's jealous. He loves Christ with a jealous love. Dostoevsky was indeed a child of his age, as he says here, a spectacularly flawed individual. He suffered from nervous ailments that grew into full-blown epilepsy, all of which were exacerbated by chain smoking and constant caffeination. He was intolerant of other nations and creeds, and he held grudges for insults that were sometimes purely imagined. He was sexually promiscuous. He cheated on his dying wife with a younger woman. He became an obsessive gambler and frittered away money needed by his wife and by his late brother's family. But it was in this very ability to live dangerously, I think, which he always associated with that last moment of a man condemned to death, that Dostoevsky found the strength for a powerful assertion and reformation of his art. What I like to call his wager on artistic form, which he thought could disrupt and change the underlying and prevailing logic of modern society and provide the pledge of a new world. It was this wager on wholly new artistic forms that one sees in his works beginning in 1861 with Notes from the Dead House, his fictionalized memoir of his time in the prison camps, and which continued especially through Notes from Underground in 1863-64, which he saw as demonstrating, quote, the need for faith and Christ. Now here I want to make a quick digression into the history of Russian Christianity in order to underscore the ways in which Dostoevsky's aesthetic approach to Christ, Christianity, and in fact to critique of modern society allowed for a new understanding of Russian Christianity. The history of Orthodoxy is replete with affirmations of the salvific effects of beauty. My favorite example is on the board here, and it's the account of the baptism of Rus, which was the early name for Russia, in the Russian Primary Chronicle under the year 988, which suggests that the pagan Grand Prince Vladimir chose Byzantine Christianity, Eastern Christianity, or Orthodox Christianity, over its rivals, among which were Islam, Judaism, and Western Christianity, or Roman Catholicism, precisely for the aesthetic qualities of the Eastern Christian Church. The story goes that when first of all, Vladimir summoned to himself representatives of all the major religions. This is the description of Western Christians, who were already seen as quite different from the Eastern Church, although the schism would only be formalized in the 11th century. Then came the Germans, the chronicler tells us, asserting that they were emissaries of the Pope. They added, "Thus says the Pope, your country is like our country, but your faith is not like ours. For our faith is the light. We worship God who made heaven and earth, the stars, the moon, and every creature, while your heavens are only wood. While your gods are only wood." Vladimir inquired what their teaching was, and they replied, "Fasting according to one's strength. But whatever one eats and drinks is all to the glory of God, as our teacher Paul has said." Vladimir answered, "Depart from hence. Our fathers accepted no such principle." I should note that Vladimir rejected Islam by saying that drinking is the happiness of Russia, and we cannot do without that. Now, Vladimir followed this up by sending envoys to all lands representing the major faiths, and the envoys then returned and reported. When we journeyed among the Bulgarians, which means not the modern Bulgarians, but the Turkic-speaking people of the time, we beheld how they worship in their temple called a mosque while they stand ungirt. The Bulgarian bows, sits down, looks hither and thither like one possessed, and there is no happiness among them, but only sorrow and a dreadful stench. Their religion is not good. Then we went among the Germans and saw them performing, which again, Roman Catholics, and saw them performing many ceremonies in their temples, but we beheld no glory there. Now this is the word glory, which in Greek, as in Slavonic, could also mean a kind of glory or praise, or even light, as it was, some kind of spectacular illumination. Then we went to Greece, and the Greeks led us to edifices where they worshipped their god, and we knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. For on earth there is no such splendor or such beauty, and we are at a loss how to describe it. We know only that God there dwells among men, and their service is fairer than the ceremonies of other nations. So we see already here, in essentially the first document of the Russian apprehension of Christianity, the emphasis on the aesthetic, material, sense-perceptible evidence of the faith. And we can trace this through the ages, which we'll do extremely quickly here, by looking at the Orthodox icon. This is a very early icon, one of the earliest surviving Russian icons of an archangel, which has become kind of a symbol of the Russian apprehension of Christianity as a phenomenon of beauty above all. This perhaps is the most famous single famous Russian icon, Andrei Rublev's Old Testament Trinity, which has been read as a visible form of divine harmony. You might notice how the image, the shape of the chalice, for example, is repeated in the shape of the table, or the throne, as it's called there, and then of the angels themselves, this cup-shaped form, which signifies the love that unites the three persons of the Trinity. I want to focus a bit more on this icon, the Saviour not made by human hands, for a couple of different reasons. For one thing, this is an icon that exists in the Catholic tradition as the Veronica cloth or veil. It is an icon that purports to be a material trace of divine presence. If in the West the icon is associated with the story of Veronica wiping Christ's face with the cloth while he was on the road to Calvary, in the East the legend runs that King Abgar requested that Christ send him his image as a kind of long-distance conversion. In both cases, the principle of representation is the same. God is not in this icon, and in this sense it is not an idol, and in a decisive sense, not an idol. Yet it testifies materially to the presence of God in the past, to the incarnation of God in Christ, and obliquely through the absence of God today after Christ's resurrection. It's like in Rome, the footprint of Christ in the church Quo Vadis, left by Christ when he was still on earth. Now, Dostoevsky was obsessed with the mystery of the image that both grants and withholds its gifts, like this icon, the gifts of knowledge, of intimacy, and of grace. I think that one can often see a reflection of this obsession in the vivid faces, or physiognomies, as he often put it, that populate his fictions. The inmates of the dead house, the underground man, Raskolnikov, Prince Myshkin, Stavrogin, Zosima. All of these and many more continue to live alongside us, with us. They have, to a considerable extent, formed the very world in which we live. Yet the characters themselves and their faces never exhaust the meaning, the depths of Dostoevsky's novels, which see the public faces of characters as kind of interfaces between our worlds and inner identities which remain beyond our ken. Dostoevsky attributed the greatest significance to a character that he defined as remaining undetermined and unclear, that is to say, still in the process of being born. This was the character Alyosha Karamazov, a protagonist who was so open to the future that he resisted having his portrait finalized by Dostoevsky. His face, Dostoevsky seems to suggest in this very curious preface to the novel, is a window through which the light of the future floods in. Still, Dostoevsky's approach to his fiction was very often visual, though, as many memoirists remark, he had very little interest in nature as such. It was instead the landscape of the human soul and its visual expression in the face that fascinated him. His narrators often appear as chroniclers, not as shapers of events that take place as if beyond their control and often beyond their ken. All major characters emerge into his novels as faces, suggest that he's kind of painting as if from a distance, suggestive of the inequalities, but never quite comprehensible, never full, as actors and as mysteries in their own right. His manuscripts, for instance, if one looks at them, Dostoevsky's manuscripts are filled with doodled faces and architectural details that portray his education as an engineer. And his narratives, if you think of them, are based in these manuscripts around little dramatic scenes, that is as if Dostoevsky is watching in his mind, in which he then builds his narratives around. So as in Baroque painting, and as in the theatre, the difference between evil and good, pain and happiness in Dostoevsky's novels is above all a matter of illumination. And the mystery of human face is something that remains crucial when we look at Dostoevsky the man. It was something that many of his contemporaries wrote about when recounting their meetings with him. Like some of his true characters, Dostoevsky's face seemed very expressive. It gave rise to very long descriptions, and yet it always seemed to conceal more than it revealed. For example, this is the first known portrait of Dostoevsky by his schoolmate, Konstantin Krutovsky, who wrote, "At that time, Fyodor Mikhailovich was quite slim. His face was pale and grey in hue, his hair fair and thin, his eyes deep set, but his gaze penetrating and profound. His movements were somehow awkward and at the same time impulsive. His uniform sat clumsily on him, while his pack, hat and rifle seemed like so many chains that he was obliged to bear and which oppressed him. Always focused inwardly, in his free time he was constantly walking back and forth by himself, not seeing or hearing what was happening around him." If we skip forward a couple of decades, we see the memoir of Varvara Timofeeva, who worked at a printing plant of the magazine that Dostoevsky edited in 1873-1874. She encountered Dostoevsky for the first time as not tall, of medium height, in a fur coat and galoshes. She was very conscious of the contrast between this unprepossessing guise and the expectations she had already constructed based on the works of which she was a very avid reader. She writes, "This was a very pale man, with an earthly-coloured, sickly paleness, not young, with a gloomy and emaciated face covered as with a net by some unusually expressive shadows from the tensely restrained movement of his muscles, as if every muscle on his face with the hollow cheeks and wide and thus noble brow was inspirited by emotion and thought, and these emotions and thoughts flooded irrepressibly outwards, but they were blocked by the iron will of this simultaneously weak and heady man. He was all as if locked up by a key, no movements, not a single gesture, only his thin, bloodless lips twittered nervously when he spoke. I was struck by his strange gait. He walked unhurriedly, with a measured and short step, shifting his weight heavily from leg to leg, as inmates walk in their leg irons." We see in both of these memoirs, by the way, that the idea that we can read in his physiognomy a record of Dostoevsky's suffering. In the first one, the chains that the memoirist saw. In this one, the leg irons. Another one of Dostoevsky's female acquaintances, and his female acquaintances were very often people with whom he was flirting, at the very least, said that each of the wrinkles on Dostoevsky's face had its own biography. But if we look at the contrast between this first apprehension of his face and what happened when she won this woman, Varvara Timofeeva, won his confidence. He seems physically transformed by the opening up to her, as if illumined by a powerful thought, vividly pale and completely young, with the expressively reticent shape of his thin lips. It breathed with the triumph of its mental power, with the proud knowledge of its power. This was neither a good nor an evil face. It somehow simultaneously attracted and repulsed, frightened and fascinated, and I unconsciously riveted, looked at his face, as if I suddenly saw a living picture with mysterious content, when you greedily rush to capture its meaning, knowing that one more second and all this rare beauty will disappear like a flash of lightning. So I won't read these ones out, but we see also in this memoirist a contrast between this first apprehension when Dostoevsky comes across as being a puzzle and very much closed, and then the illumination that appears in his very face, in his physiognomy, once the interlocutor wins Dostoevsky's confidences. This is the second one. And one of the things that you notice that Dostoevsky becomes physically active in the second, in the descriptions when the memoirists suddenly feel as if they're seeing the real Dostoevsky. Now, this is one last portrait for you. The most famous one, executed by Vasily Pirov, a major artist of the time, in 1872. This was seen as the most successful one. Just as an illustration of how difficult it must be to capture Dostoevsky's guise, here are some well-known caricatures based on this portrait, which look like very different people. And here are some of the book covers that I've collected over the last couple of years by Dostoevsky, showing bearded men who share absolutely nothing with Dostoevsky, actually. Seems as long as you get the beard, you can call it Dostoevsky. But anyway, going back to Pirov's portrait, it was a controversial one. Some newspaper reviewers found it inscrutable. But Dostoevsky's second wife thought it captured Dostoevsky's particular expression whenever he was engaged in conjuring up fictional reality in his mind. Dostoevsky himself was satisfied, and later on in his Diary of a Writer, he reflected on the experience of sitting for a portrait. This is very much worth thinking about here. One must portray reality as it is, they say. And when he says they here, he means the various realists, the naturalists, who want Dostoevsky to focus on describing social reality without any kind of transcendental or transcendent ambition. One must portray reality as it is, they say, whereas reality such as this does not exist and never has on earth, because the essence of things is inaccessible to man. He perceives nature as it is reflected in his ideas after it has passed through his senses. Accordingly, more scope must be given to the idea, and the ideal should not be feared. A portraitist, for example, seats his subject to paint his portrait. He prepares, he studies the subject carefully. Why does he do that? Because he knows from experience that a person does not always look like himself. And therefore, he seeks out the principal idea of his physiognomy, that moment when the subject most resembles the self. The portraitist's gift consists in the ability to seek out and capture that moment. And so what is the artist doing here, if not trusting first his own idea, the ideal, more than the reality before him? The ideal is also reality after all, and just as legitimate as immediate reality. Now, Dostoevsky's crucial role, I've been arguing throughout this lecture, in documenting, revealing, and interpreting modernity is attributable in part to his willingness to be possessed both by the forces of history and by the ideal which he has kept in his soul. To project these forces of history as cacophonous voices and to be animated by them in a kind of manic mimicry, making a wager that the very authenticity of his effort as an artist will allow modernity to become illumined anew by the light of the ideal of the future. Ultimately, by the light of Christ. Constantly against this redemptive face, this ideal which he keeps, as it were, above his work, guiding his searches into the depths of modern reality, the modern world, there arises a monk's gallery of physiognomies and, more disquietingly, an almost anatomical analysis of the physiology of modernity. Noting Dostoevsky's indifference to landscape, his friend Alexander Wrangel, he was a friend from the time in Siberia, described Dostoevsky as being absorbed by the study of man with all of his virtues, weaknesses, and passions. With the art of the great anatomist, Dostoevsky noted the tiniest deformations of the human soul. And this theme of Dostoevsky, not only as the physiognomist, the study of the human face, but also as the physiologist, arises some years later in a letter by a man named Fyodor Tolstoy, not Leo Tolstoy, written to one of Dostoevsky's friends, Alyosha Karamazov. It is obvious that Dostoevsky's man with flayed skin, in the spirit of Michelangelo, warms your gaze. He's addressing Dostoevsky's friend here. You would hang this anatomical masterpiece, this bloodied flesh, above your desk in order to enjoy its contemplation to the full. I admire it as a conscientious and even anatomically informed work, but I would rather keep it further from my eyes. Those who are present at this experiment in anima vi see how the muscles ripple, the blood flows in streams, and most terrible of all, they see themselves reflected in the eyes, this mirror of the soul, and in the thoughts of the man whose dissection the author conducts. Now, I found this not long ago, and as far as I can tell, what Tolstoy is referring to here is this part of Michelangelo's fresco, The Last Judgment from the Sistine Chapel, where St. Bartholomew is reduced to this skin here, which suggests the human visage as a kind of detachable image. I think that perhaps what Tolstoy had in mind was more these kinds of later physiological adaptations of Michelangelo's image, which reveal the rippling musculature and throbbing vessels that are concealed by the external visage. Throughout his studies, in any case, throughout his studies of the flesh and form of his time, which to a significant degree, I repeat, remains our time, Dostoevsky remained painfully aware of the tension between the visible aspect and the inward life, both in the modern individual and in modern society as a whole. So how, in these sometimes gruesome and tortuous studies of human faces and bodies, does the ideal of Christ shine through? The novel Crime and Punishment is, I think, the boldest and clearest representation of this. I trust that many of you are familiar with this novel, if only through high school reading, although we argued about this before the lecture, whether it's in the high school curriculum, through adaptations such as Robert Bresson's film Pickpocket, or the recent graphic novel featuring Batman and Robin as Raskolnikov and Sonia. The novel, I don't know if I should leave that up. I'll leave that up. The novel begins with Raskolnikov murdering an old pawnbroker and her sister Lizaveta, and proceeds to analyze Raskolnikov's descent into guilt and paranoia and his search for a plausible explanation of his actions. He tries to justify the premeditated murder of the pawnbroker with ideological reasons, but he can never quite confront the second murder, that of Lizaveta, the sister, who had just blundered into the scene of the crime and which had been therefore unplanned and which revealed the kind of predatory bestiality with which Raskolnikov could not reconcile himself. By taking the life of others, it turns out he'd end up cancelling out the justification for his own existence. And it is only Sonia, or Batman in some readings, a girl driven into prostitution by the need to support her family, who makes him confront the need for repentance, not by shaming him, not by driving him to repent, but by loving him. As Lizaveta's friend, Sonia is uniquely placed to make Raskolnikov confront the full horror of his murders and at the same time to demonstrate the possibility of redemption. She gives him, for example, Lizaveta's cross and her Bible, which is tantamount to giving Raskolnikov back the gift of life. As often in Dostoevsky, it is not so much what she does, but the light that she sheds on him that leads Raskolnikov to the path of repentance, though the novel is ultimately ambivalent about whether he reaches his destination. The novel acts upon the reader less by persuasion. Similar to Sonia, the novel acts upon the reader less by persuasion than by a kind of breathless involvement. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre saw Crime and Punishment as enacting and enabling readers' freedom by placing us within a space where we are required to respond in some way, in some ethical way. Thus, we are placed into an ethical position vis-à-vis the protagonist, and, Sartre believed, forced to respond with love. Rowan Williams, who is a very accomplished scholar of Russian culture and thought, in addition to being the Archbishop of Canterbury, has recently offered a major restatement of the novel's impact, ethical impact, in a way that I think follows on Sartre's ideas. The combination, he writes, of the gift of Lizaveta's cross and the reading from Lizaveta's Bible in Crime and Punishment has the effect of beginning to introduce Raskolnikov into a different moral and spiritual world. The identification of God with the helpless and forgotten victim, with the accidentally murdered Lizaveta, and the exploited and disgraced Sonia as she reads, or with the many anonymous and silenced victims of the Inquisitor amongst whom Christ stands, this is in Brothers Karamazov, echoes the creation out of nothing on which the universe rests. It is not a case of humanity somehow rising to identification with God through spiritual excellence and moral achievement, but of the divine gratuitously taking the form of those most deeply humiliated and stripped of status and pride in order to affirm their human dignity and eternal significance to their persecutors. The human imitator of divine love is one who has first recognized his or her dependence on the grace and glory that is secretly all around. Sartre would say, on the freedom that is all around. Both Sartre and Williams, therefore, see the reader of Dostoevsky as escaping from those webs of necessity that I spoke about earlier, which could be economic necessity, emotional necessity, some kind of necessity caused by a health condition, and entering into an economy instead of freedom and grace. You might recognize Williams' statement here as a reformulation of ideas that recur in Dostoevsky's final masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov, which, by the way, provided a wholly new and unimaginably influential apprehension of Russian orthodoxy. And it is here, then, time for me to confront the elephant in the room, which has also already been mentioned, Dostoevsky's attitude towards Catholicism, to which he was, in most ways, far from close. Among other things, The Brothers Karamazov includes the legend of the Grand Inquisitor, which tells of Christ returning to counter-Reformation Spain and being crucified again, this time by prelates of the Roman Catholic Church, which has succumbed to the three temptations which Christ rejected in the desert, namely miracle, mystery, and power. Rich in resonances and ambiguities, the legend of the Grand Inquisitor raises many fascinating possible interpretations, but I'm going to focus here on interpreting the single dimension of Dostoevsky's attitude towards Catholicism. First, this story is told by a character in the novel and cannot therefore be taken as face value as representing Dostoevsky's views. However, it does resonate quite markedly with passages from other passages from Dostoevsky's fiction, most notably the diatribe against Catholicism in The Idiot, 1868, and also from Dostoevsky's voluminous non-fiction commentaries, which most notably in his Diary of a Writer, which he kept and published over 3 years in the 1870s. Here we see that the hostility to Catholicism has much to do with 19th century politics, and specifically the role of the papacy in supporting reactionary regimes. In Rowan Williams' view, Dostoevsky is attacking not Catholicism itself, but rather, quote, a secularizing move in Catholic thinking and practice, one that seeks to resolve religious doubt by appealing not to the free consensus of persons united in the body of Christ, but to a supreme executive authority, the papacy, which becomes a monarchy on the model of other monarchies, and so sets itself up as a rival political power. In this reliance on temporal power, Dostoevsky thought, Catholics of his day had absolved themselves not only of the radical doubt of their age, but also of the radical solution, the very possibility of a radical solution that he saw in this wager on faith in Christ as the ideal of beauty and light. It is remarkable to think that his anti-Catholic views were written in the very same novel, the very same time that he was discovering for himself the power of Raphael's Sistine Madonna, as Catholic an image and as unorthodox an image as one can imagine, perhaps. So I think that Dostoevsky was close to Catholic in the sense that he gestured towards a Christianity based on the economy of the image, specifically on the image of Christ, which though faced both east and west, remains one, a fact that is captured in the parallel accounts of the image of the Saviour not made by human hands that I talked about earlier. Ultimately, Dostoevsky was devoted to examining how this image, and therefore how the image as such, including the images of modern fiction, even the images of modern photography, for example, which he was fascinated with, serve as sites of revelation about the cosmos, about society and the human individual. His aesthetic statements present a consistent theory, I hope I've suggested at least, as manifesting the stresses and locating the potentials that remain latent even within modern reality. As Rowan Williams has written, Dostoevsky created spaces, quote, in which we are invited not to contemplate the dilemmas of an individual which may or may not mirror our own, but to inhabit a narrative world whose center of gravity is hidden, as it is in all daily experience, but whose distinctive boundaries are capable of being sensed obliquely yet firmly. Like an icon, then, Dostoevsky's fictions communicate a material trace of the divine in the world, a world in which the divine is almost spectacularly absent sometimes to our view. It was this that has made Dostoevsky such an influence, I think, on Catholic thought and perhaps most crucially Catholic art in the 20th century. Although one of the most implacable opponents of the Roman Catholic Church as a historical force, Dostoevsky actually ended up being one of the forces of its spiritual regeneration, I think, especially through a return to the notion of art as a medium of grace. Now, in conclusion, this aesthetic creed is confirmed by his own abiding image as an agent and victim of the split between spirituality and corporeality in our age, as a victim of iron modernity and an agent of freedom and grace. Many have examined Dostoevsky to try to pin him down in one way or another. I'd like to close by urging you to read him, or to reread him, with an open mind, to allow his work to become a locus of something new in your lives and in the world we share. Thank you.
We'll now have time for questions.
Objections, protests. Yes?
I have a question. In this lecture, you had referenced the importance of icons. You know, one lecture in a story about the conversion of the Russians to Orthodoxy, the aesthetic component of the worship. But yet, towards the end, when you were discussing near Catholicism, you mentioned how the importance of the image of Catholicism. And I'm wondering if we were emphasizing the importance of the visual in Western Orthodoxy, how then do you make that link to Catholicism?
Catholicism is also venerates the image, right? We were discussing something about this earlier, related to what I'm thinking about here, and it's just that let's say if you walk into a Catholic church, I shouldn't, standing here, generalize at all, not walking into a Catholic church. Sorry?
Repeat the question, please.
Oh, how do I reconcile the fact that I began by illustrating how the Russians rejected Western Christianity because of the lack of an aesthetic dimension, and yet later on I said that East and West share an aesthetic dimension. Now, I mean, look like I'm praying. Praying for an answer. You know, the responses that we have in the chronicle there are pretty funny at times, as the one about drinking. You know, obviously in the West there was a very rich tradition at that very time of representations of the divine in churches, in liturgy, etc. It is, however, interesting that they perceived, perhaps, maybe it was because of the particular Catholics that they were in contact with at that time, but they perceived a certain reticence about it, one that became demonstrated later on in the Reformation with the new wave of iconoclasm, and perhaps came also manifested in the 19th and 20th centuries in Western churches, which became very bereft of images. And I shouldn't generalize about Catholic churches standing here in this particular spot and not being particularly knowledgeable about it, but many of the ones that I go into these days have Russian icons in them somewhere, sometimes back in the altar, the Trinity of Rudolph, another one, which shows that Catholicism has, in a sense, rediscovered the image, in part through the Russian or Orthodox iconographic traditions. So, I mean, there is a fudging, definitely, of facts there, but I think the tendency is more or less one can defend these observations as general tendencies. And one sees in calls for a revitalized liturgical life or ritual life in Catholicism, sometimes an influence of Russian theology, or Orthodox, I should say, Orthodox theology of the liturgy, etc., and specifically of the icon. So, does that answer the question?
So you're saying that the importance of imagery and the visual experience of Orthodoxy is obviously something that's shared with Catholicism, looking at the history of
Yes,
the
just
Protestant
right.
Church, and that is something that students and traditions have in common.
Exactly. From the very beginning and through, this is something that comes out in the literature. I mean, you can really trace, although the schism was formalized in the 11th century, and we can see elements of the schism long before, in fact, for several centuries afterwards, there continued to be a very interesting interchange between the two traditions, and one can see that there are books, let's say, calling to mind parallels in the theology of the Trinity between this icon, which Russia didn't have a very well-developed theological tradition at the time. So we look at these icons and we see perhaps the clearest indication of how they were thinking about God theoretically at the time. And there's a book which brings this icon into discourse with medieval scholastic and mystical concepts of the Trinity, for example, and which I think clearly shows that there's a lot of commonality into the 13th, 14th centuries. It's really with the Reformation, and then the Counter-Reformation that the paths of Catholicism and Orthodoxy really split quite radically. And right at the period that Dostoevsky is writing is where this split is really formalized most clearly in the First Vatican Council and the restructuring of Europe with the unification of Italy and Germany and all of this. This is what Dostoevsky is really responding to. It's something that really changed with the Second Vatican Council, and this whole relationship has now changed quite radically. Yeah.
Leading off of what you were speaking to, what struck me, or what strikes me about Dostoevsky's writing, or his novels, I've read the novels, is although he does have references to Russian Orthodoxy and many references, it's not, as you say, you could say, you can't perceive a very developed theology maybe. At the same time, Dostoevsky seems to be very concerned with human problems, and in that sense, it seems interesting that he seems attracted to the more human part of the Renaissance. But I wonder if you could say something more specifically regarding Dostoevsky's connections precisely with Orthodoxy and his own religious experience.
Well, everything you've said is very interesting. I just ran across a passage the other day in a memoir about Dostoevsky where he seemed to be rejecting Orthodox iconography in favor of things like a Sistine Madonna, for example. And in fact, Rowan Williams, in his recent book, which I recommend to everyone who finds this general topic interesting, because it's quite remarkable that a sitting Archbishop of Canterbury can produce such an incredibly well-informed, balanced, interesting and somewhat daring book about Dostoevsky. But it's probably the best thing on Dostoevsky and religion, I think, right now, that exists. And he claims in that book that Dostoevsky really doesn't show much interest in Orthodox theology or ideas throughout his life, and he seems to come at it sometimes through Western thought. And it's quite interesting, when he was in prison in 1849, he requested that his brother send him a gospel, a New Testament, he said, but only in French. He said. And I often puzzle why he would want it in French. I think it must have something to do with the literature he was reading at the time. It was somehow interesting to read Hugo and Balzac together with the... But it shows you that he maybe knew the Gospels through a kind of French reception and a 19th century Western readings, things like Ernst Renan, for example, the life of Jesus, and that whole tradition. Now, the question that you ended up with is a very large question. He was raised as in a more or less traditional, in a more or less normal family. He observed all of the rites of passage, and he never really ceased using the traditional turns of phrase that an Orthodox uses. And one finds in his correspondence from the 1840s, even when he was being radicalized and getting involved in this revolutionary group, expressions which suggest a continuing faith, at least in Christ, if not in the church, which was essentially at that time a department of state and had been discredited in the eyes of many intellectuals as a spiritual institution. Now, when he goes away to Siberia, he encounters a very different orthodoxy, which is the orthodoxy of the very simple people, and moreover, simple criminal people. And he has his Gospels. And this certainly changes his view of Christ, as we saw from that letter, but one can't say that that's a very orthodox expression, and it never seems like he became close to the peasant view or the peasant practice of orthodoxy. And one doesn't see in his own writings, in his fictional writings, or in his other kinds of writings, or in his letters, much note of going to church, for example, regularly. And this is something that's contradictory. In some memoirs, they say he went to church very often. One would often see him standing at the back of the church, humbly observing the rites, and some people said he never went. He led a very irregular kind of lifestyle with all his caffeine, and he liked to write at night, and he would often go to bed at dawn and wake up towards evening. And he didn't make it to church very often. But as time goes on, he seems to become much more pious in certain ways. And there's a very famous story in 1878 of how he visited this monastery, Optina Pustin, the center of kind of resurgence of monasticism in Russia at the time, together with a young friend of his. And this was after the death of one of his children, I think he was 3 years old, really the child that Dostoevsky seems to have been most attached to, his last child. And this was, of course, while he was writing The Brothers Karamazov. So there seems to have been a change here. And yet the depiction of orthodoxy that we find in The Brothers Karamazov was very controversial at the time. We have a depiction, if you remember the novel, there are 2 elders in the monastery that we see. There's Zosima, who is a very kind of St. Francis type of figure, talking to the birds and the animals, etc. And then we have Father Firapont, who's very strict and who sees demons everywhere, and he's trying to keep order, a spiritual order. Father Firapont looks much more like a traditional Russian monk than Father Zosima. And after the novel was published, one of Dostoevsky's contemporaries, and in some ways an ally, wrote very scathing articles against the novel, accusing Dostoevsky of propagating what he called pink or rosy Christianity. All lovey-dovey, all sort of hugs and nice stories and incense and things, without dealing with the moral battle, which is orthodoxy, which is Christianity, which is Christian faith on a daily basis. There's clear delineation between good and evil, and a drawing of lines in the world. And so, in that sense, Dostoevsky never really found a place in official Orthodox discourse. And yet, the novel has completely reshaped the way that we think about orthodoxy. So, in many ways, if we look at it officially, Dostoevsky it's very difficult to call him orthodox with a small o or with a capital O, really. And yet, he has to be recognized, I think, as one of the main figures in Orthodox theology, in Orthodox representations of orthodoxy, in self-representations of orthodoxy, from 1860 on. So it's something that we have to deal very carefully with and try to get. There's a recent book Rowan Williams' book, I think, is the best one. There's another recent book called Dostoevsky's Religion by a man named Stephen Cassidy, at the University of California, San Diego, who argues that Dostoevsky really, we really have to work to figure out what Dostoevsky meant by religion, what he meant by orthodoxy. And a lot of the work that we have to do is getting rid of the influence that Dostoevsky has had, because so much of the way that we understand orthodoxy was created by Dostoevsky. So how do we recognize whether Dostoevsky matched what orthodoxy was at the time, if our own concepts of orthodoxy were changed? So we get into this circle, and Cassidy tries somewhat mercilessly to cut away all of this Dostoevsky influence and get back to see how Dostoevsky was at the time. Yes?
You mentioned that Dostoevsky wasn't necessarily the most virtuous person.
Yes.
On the other hand, there was that idea that he inspires this certain ethos in the reader, and that he is a great social critic. I'm wondering what these ethical aspects of it have to do with religion, whether they related at all, or which.
Well, my argument is essentially that they become related to religion by asserting the value of the aesthetic realm, the aesthetic experience, as part of the religious experience, or as an avenue towards the religious experience. Dostoevsky seems to have described what he was doing as being true to art. Even I excluded this for interest of time, but even in the interrogations in 1849, when they were asking him, did you or did you not do this seditious act? He would say, and all of his seditious acts were related to copying and disseminating texts. He would say, I'm an artist. I don't approach my work from the standpoint of trying to propagate a particular idea. I think of images. I think in images, and I work with images. And he was true to that throughout his life. Even in that letter the day of his execution, I have these images in my mind. Now, we can look at his actions and say he wasn't behaving very well while he had those images in his mind. And we can, but the challenge is to come up with a different, as it were, ethical framework that allows us to bracket an author's personal behavior, foibles, even his personal beliefs, and think about the effects of the work that that person produces in the world. So no one's talking about canonizing Dostoevsky. And we were talking about this also before with Chesterton. Would it be possible to talk about canonizing Chesterton, given his somewhat large appetites for various kinds of worldly pleasures, etc.? That's an interesting question, maybe for the biographers and for the agencies that deal with that within the church. But I think Dostoevsky is asking us to have a different set of criteria for artworks, to think about whether an artwork produces effects which are interesting, revelatory in a religious sense. And that's what Sartre and Williams and lesser people like myself also are trying to argue about Dostoevsky in this case. Does that answer the question? Not really?
That was really interesting also, but the relation between the ethic that he was trying to inspire and the religious path he followed. Or was he trying to inspire that at all?
It's an interesting question. Was he trying to inspire? You mean as in a particular mode of behavior in his readers, for example?
Like love was the one.
Yeah. Well, definitely. But what does it mean to call people to love? In a sense, I think this is why I focused on these two categories, freedom and love, because we can never, in fact, tell someone what it would mean for them to act in freedom, right, or to act in love for someone else. that has to come from their own being in that situation and their own response to a situation. And what I think Sartre and Williams are talking about here is Dostoevsky's interest in putting us in situations we don't expect and eliciting from us powers which we don't know we have, and which he doesn't also know that we have. And therefore there's this crucial preface to the Brothers Karamazov, and if you have the novel at home, just 2 pages, where he describes his protagonist, Alyosha Karamazov. And he's precisely saying this. This is a new kind of person, and we don't know what he's going to be like. And if Dostoevsky is trying to project anything into the world, it's this kind of new person. And yet he doesn't want to specify what that new person is going to do, because that would contravene that person's freedom to be new, in fact. And so he's trying to prophesy the appearance of new kind of people, new kind of person, without actually specifying, I think. And that's precisely the ethical challenge within the aesthetic realm, that one can't dictate at all. It's eliciting the new. Yes?
You said quite a lot about Dostoevsky's attitude toward orthodoxy. Could you say a little bit about orthodoxy's attitude toward Dostoevsky, and especially a little bit, because you know so much about 20th century Soviet life too. One thing you were talking about at dinner was this extraordinary power Dostoevsky has to be read by Russians throughout all these periods. He's an enormously popular writer at the end of the 19th century. He's read throughout the Soviet period, and I gather he's still a popular writer after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Now, begin by saying something about what the Orthodox Church thought about Dostoevsky, and then how is it that he's managed to, as it were, survive through the 20th century as primarily a Russian writer, it seems like.
Well, I'd answer the second question. Maybe you won't like my answer, but just by repeating what I said to the previous question. I think Dostoevsky survives because he wasn't trying to impose anything on his readers. He was providing spaces for them to discover themselves, and each generation discovers something new in it. And this is why I think he continues to live. Now, with the first question, again, I don't know if I can come up with a satisfactory answer. The Orthodox Church has never been able to speak with a voice, let alone a unified voice, even a cacophonous voice, any kind of voice on most anything of all. But it's never even tried really to talk about things that aren't directly under its purview. Only recently, in the last about 2-3 years ago, it came out with a social document for the first time in its history, kind of detailing its attitude to things like abortion and capital punishment, etc. And before then, it was also kind of assumed or understood, or it was a matter for individual clergy to, or I suppose bishops to instruct their clergy on. But the Orthodox Church, before 1917, was a Department of State. And I'm going to ask you what that is later on. I thought someone was playing guitar in the next room, but it's very repetitious guitar. Right. Sorry. That's gone. Before 1917, the Department of State, it was very, very unambitious intellectually. There was a great fear of theological innovation and theological daring. There were individuals who, despite that, actually wrote original theological work. But if they engaged with Dostoevsky, it was as individual authors in the Church never ruled. Now, for a brief period after 1917, the Church kind of regained its independence, its momentum. It had more pressing things to deal with than Dostoevsky's place. And then it fell under Soviet domination until 1990, and since then, so you can only go, since then it's again returned to a kind of creative anarchy, one might say. So you can ask priests, you can ask bishops, and each one will have read, I'm sure, Dostoevsky's major works at least, and have an opinion, but they will be different. Some people will agree with Dostoevsky's contemporary Leontiev that this is false, rosy Christianity. Some people may feel that this is, in fact, the beginning of a new kind of humanistic orthodoxy that will help to balance out the spiritual and the liturgical emphasis with a kind of social teaching and an emphasis. To tell you the truth, a lot of people will just look at Dostoevsky's political writings and say, Dostoevsky was a good Russian nationalist, all Russian Orthodox should be good Russian nationalists, ergo Dostoevsky was a good Russian Orthodox. But that's just part of the contemporary political situation. So I think that those would be the three main opinions you will find. None of them, I don't think any of them is particularly interesting. And it's all a matter of individual choice, really. The only time, if I should have begun with this, the only time the church has tried to rule on something like this was when they excommunicated Tolstoy in 1901. If I'm not mistaken, 1901. Because Tolstoy had come out had written explicitly with doubts about the Eucharist and about the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, which contravenes perhaps the major dogma of the Orthodox Church, and the Orthodox authorities felt themselves obliged to make a public gesture and say, that is not acceptable. You can do anything you like, but once you do that, you're no longer Orthodox, and we excommunicate you. And that was an act that didn't go down very well at all with anyone, really, and has never been repeated. And they've, after that, they've kind of retreated from making judgments like that. So.
Okay, that's all we have time for. Please join me in thanking Professor Berg.